In class, or in the video lecture you would have just watched in the last section, I talked about some reasons for downslope soil motion. So this is motion of anything that's loose, small, mobile, so things like small soil particles, small sand grains, and soil. Here again, geomorphologists have been sloppy for a long time. We should really talk about mobile material, but soil is this like shorthand for whatever is loose and broken up. And oftentimes the two of them are the exact same, but as I mentioned, in some cases, soil forming processes haven't actually affected the loose material at the surface in places such as those dominated by, let's say, recently deposited glacial till, sand dunes, etc. So I came up with some ideas, and back when I taught this class in 2016, in quite a different form, the students in the class came up with some ideas as well. And so here are a number of different processes that occur, and I left some space so I can do a little bit of doodling along with you and sketch out what some of these look like. So for example, one of them is rain splash. And so if you imagine that this raindrop, and raindrops tend to be quite elongated as they fall through the atmosphere, so that here's my little cartoon raindrop. As that falls down, let's go for a vertical down arrow, that's close enough, and hits the ground surface is made up of a whole bunch of little tiny, I'll just draw all these little circles, little tiny grains, little particles. And this raindrop is impacting at its terminal velocity, right? And that terminal velocity is determined by the mass of the raindrop compared to its cross-sectional area and the density of air, the fluid that's moving through. So when it impacts, it actually creates a cascade of grain motions, scattering material all around it in a way that's very similar to a impact cratering body, so something like an asteroid or a meteorite hitting Moon, the Mars, or Earth, but they have to get through our atmosphere, so it's a little harder for them to hit here. So what that then does is eventually create a surface that has this kind of raised rim and this zone in the middle that is a little bit lower. And so this is where the rain splash would have hit. So that can move material laterally on a hill slope, and we'll see shortly that if the surface is tilted instead of being planar, that the raindrop impact can actually then send more material downslope than upslope. So that's one option. Another one is overland flow or sheet wash. And so if you imagine, I'm just going to draw this little cross-sectional hill slope. And so this is underground. So if there's a lot of rain, so here's my favorite little cloud, and we've got lots of little raindrops coming off of it. If there is a lot of rain, such that it's raining harder and faster than that water can soak into the soil, so hard rain, or if the groundwater table, shorthand over here, or if the groundwater table is actually at the surface such that there's nowhere to go, there's already somebody there, that can cause this water to run off over the surface. And when water flows over the surface, it can detach and move particles, and that's called sheet wash. Another possibility is burrowing mammals. And so if I draw the side of this hill slope right here, and there's a gopher that decides to create a burrow like that, and it's a little happy home, so let's just give it a little heart. Which way is the burrow going to throw the dirt that comes out of it? Is it going to throw the soil up out of here so it mounds here and then kind of falls back in and fills in its hole and creates a big dirty mess? No, gophers like clean homes, just like we do. It's going to throw it all downhill. And so by throwing it downhill, by throwing hill slope material downhill, gophers enhance Hillslope creep. I'm just adding soil here because we often say soil. Burrowing invertebrates also poof up the soil. And so you can think about things like earthworms, for example. And one thing for those of you guys who are in northern latitudes and previously glaciated regions and or on fairly isolated islands is that earthworms were not native. So here in Minnesota, we used to have soils that had a very large O horizon that is composed of leaf litter. Let me just pretend that leaves actually stand up like this, even though they don't, because I don't know how else to make it recognizable in lecture notes. We're gonna give them a couple veins. Boom. All right, and then below that there would be an A horizon, right, with some sort of mix of of mineral plus humic matter. And what earthworms do is little annelids. I'm kind of forgetting the girdle on this other side of that. Is let's give them a totally anthropomorphized smile. Nah, that doesn't look realistic. Okay, so earthworms mix all of that together and create one big A horizon. And that actually is causing some major problems for native species in Minnesota that are used to living in this sort of thing with a giant leaf litter layer, where instead there's an A horizon, and that actually is supporting invasive species that are more used to living in places where earthworms were found. And so that's in fact threatening our fairly unique boreal ecology, and it's also similarly affecting the ecology of other areas that were, like I said, formerly glaciated, and in areas that were islands, places like Samoa that didn't have earthworms before are also having issues with the transformation of their soils by worms. And so these little nature's engineers causing a lot of problems. So one other thing that they do, though, is that they actually poof up the soil. And so if you imagine that we're again on a slope and the soil gets poofed up, it's going to expand normal to this hill slope. And that's because these worms are digging burrows that are increasing the porosity of the soil. And because we're not creating or destroying mass, this whole surface is going up. And then what way does it all collapse down? It's not going to collapse down straight back towards the soil. It's going to go straight downwards. And so through a set of steps, like going out and down and out and down, up, straight vertically down, these little tiny annelids are going to actually cause hillslope creep. So soil type is also important in this, because if you imagine that we have a soil that is very rocky desert soil, perhaps with a bunch of, let's say, large rocks on top of it that are what we call a desert pavement. So, and those rocks actually form, those rock layers actually form naturally due to deposition of dust around them. So you might have some rock, and these are often sort of, think about like kind of 1 to 10 centimeters, and then there can be some dust underneath. This is actually protecting underlying material. So that these rocky layers that form in these inflationary soils in the desert actually, and by inflationary I mean that by this dust deposition, so the dust is coming in and infiltrating between them and eventually pushing these rocks back up. So, all right. Desert pavement desert pavement. So those rocks are, those rocks are being pushed up. So those are actually protecting it and making the soil be actually more stable. Whereas you can imagine something that's like a super loose, porous soil that's just, sitting on a hill slope might be more likely to move downhill. Lithology is also important. And so, for example, if there's a limestone bedrock in it, that actually might, and by the way, for those of you who aren't geologists, this little brick thing is limestone. Dissolve. But then it also has distant fractures. I'll just actually write, it's going to be easier to understand if I just write widely spaced fractures. And so that makes it more likely to fail in large blocks. And then on the other hand, if I put a shale over here, and so the symbol for shale is just these flat lines, close fractures, and bedding planes. Breaks in small pieces. And this is going to be possibly more likely to fail, or actually, I'll just say more likely to creep. So little tiny chunks are going to move down the hill. Vegetation can also be very important, and so vegetation is important in a few separate ways. If we think about a steep hill slope, and we think about like maybe there's some rocky blocks, maybe there's some other stuff in soils, these, a tree, this is my kindergarten tree, can grab onto these rocks with their roots and can also reach deep into the soil and in fact further stabilize the hill slope. However, when this tree dies and falls over, we can have this situation in which there is now a hole left behind. Our poor happy tree, which was grabbing this rock, has now lifted that rock up and maybe some others, and maybe some soil with it, and here's its body sitting on its side thinking, oh no, how am I going to photosynthesize now that all my leaves are on the ground? And so all of these rocky chunks are eventually, as the tree decays, going to come down here and create a mound of soil here, and there's been, therefore, net displacement of soil, or, any kind of, mobile material, but in this case, the tree's growing in it, it's probably soil. So, and that's going to net move downhill. And the other thing is that even if we don't think about this tree throw problem, a tree will actually be able to, by injecting its roots into the ground, will force the land surface around it to rise up. So this might be an initial surface, but as it's pushing this mass out of the way, that's going to have to go somewhere, and that creates these little mounds around the sides of trees. And so this is our tree trunk, and eventually my little kindergarten style set of branches. These all just look like big broccoli or something. And what that then does is similar to the earthworms, that then pushes this material up and away from the surface, and then when it collapses down, it's going to be pulled down by the force of gravity and perhaps even, flow down a little bit more downhill. Very, very similar to this are the next two processes that we'll discuss, and so I'll run through them pretty quickly. So if we're in an icy environment, we can have a hill slope, and there can be some frost lens wedges that form, and there can also be some frost lenses, so this is all ice. And anytime that there's frost, whether it's just little tiny bits of frost in the ground, frozen ground like we see in the upper Midwest or in the mountains, or many other places on Earth for that matter, that is again going to take up extra space in the soil. Ice fills the pores, ice expands, ice is less dense than water, and therefore pushes material outwards away from the soil, and then that then falls down vertically under gravity when that collapses in the springtime. And so once again, We have pushing out, collapsing down, pushing out, collapsing down. Next process is tillage. So tillage is, when we're driving a tractor over a hill slope and we have the little blades that are going in to till the soil. And that, again, we'll push more material downhill than uphill. I have another thing about that later, so we'll go over it then. And then one last process that some of the students brought up was abrasion of hilltops by wind, and that's also important. So if you imagine that we have this hilltop sticking up above the landscape, and we have some wind moving towards it, the wind is going to be faster towards the top of the hill, especially if it's an isolated hill, than it is at the bottom. And if that's carrying any kind of sand particles in these swirling eddies, that can actually sandblast the rocks and create what we call benefacts. Signs of wind erosion on rock. All right. And so all of these processes together, and since I'm not going to get to the tillage until the next time, I'm going to cover it right here. So what this does then is that there's some of the material that will go uphill from the plow, but much more of the material will fall downhill under the force of gravity. And so because of this process, a little bit here, a lot of material here, tillage increases hill slope diffusion. And that's important, especially if you think about agricultural sustainability. So all these processes together that I've just discussed, I'm just going to scroll back up so we can talk through them, all cause downslope mobile material motion. So there's rain splash, overland flow, causing sheet wash, burrowing mammals, burrowing invertebrates. Different soil types impact the rate at which soils can move downslope, as well as the mechanism, whether it's through big mass failures or dissolution or gradual creep. Add a little creep right here. Lithology does as well. So if we have big blocks versus having something like a shale that breaks into teeny tiny pieces that can gradually creep down the slope. Stabilizing the hill slopes with roots is one way that vegetation can affect the hills, but then it also can lift soil around the plant or cause tree throw, which both enhance downslope motion. Freeze-thaw cycle and the growth of ice lenses can also enhance downslope motion of material, as well as similarly tillage. And wind abrasion, although a bit different from these processes that we're talking about that are transporting material, can actually cause gradual erosion of isolated rocky hilltops. So with that, I think we've thought through a number of these different processes, and one key thing about all these processes is that they tend to remove material in the case of either the dissolution of limestone or abrasion of hilltops, or largely they're moving material downhill. And so in the next step, we're going to talk about how hill slopes evolve via linear diffusion and how we can use a linear diffusive model to predict hill slope changes over time.